Well, as is typical with Chinese leadership spills or speculation, not a whole lot. China's black box of politics appears to have struck again. It's now been close to 3 weeks since Li Shangfu was seen in public. That was in Beijing. Before that, he had one trip to Russia. But the details are still pretty scant. As far as we can tell, it relates to procurement over military contracts. Basically, he was in charge of running some of those programs before he became what is effectively China's defense spokesman. That points to a potential corruption investigation. But as we've seen with some other Chinese officials, they really can run the whole gamut from extramarital affairs to potentially leadership threats. It is a system that doesn't allow for much transparency. And frankly, until the Chinese Defense Ministry formally scrubs him from the website, and then perhaps we might hear some more details on what exactly has transpired.
Yeah, which is kind of what happened before. Given these are Xi's very own appointments, and they're very recent. Yes, they're saying there's a crackdown on corruption, but what does it say about his judgment and his vetting process?
Yeah, certainly it raises questions about it. Both Li Shangfu and Qin Gang, that's China's foreign minister, who was recently cut from his position really only a month or so ago, were personal picks by Xi Jinping, as everyone is really at that upper echelon of the Chinese Communist Party. To see both your defense minister and your foreign minister go within a 6-month period, really, since they're appointed their positions, is certainly not projecting an image of stability. And it's also two of the most important public-facing roles for positions for the rest of the world. These guys are on the front line negotiating with other countries. They're negotiating nuclear deals with America, dealing with Australian trade tariffs, the whole spectrum of issues that China has to grapple with the world. And it's just lost two of its most significant voices in that. And so, there are two kind of circles of opinion on this. One is that it shows Xi Jinping's weakening power and ability to control some of his lieutenants. And the other is that really it gives him an excuse to install even more loyalist members in and around his cabinet. We won't know really until we get a replacement for General Li. But certainly with Wang Yi, who has become China's foreign minister, he has actually strengthened his hand and become both the foreign minister and the state councillor that's responsible for overall Chinese foreign policy.
Yes, a very powerful position. And the military itself, do you feel as if Xi is rethinking the military strategy? We know that he seems to be getting increasingly concerned about the fact that potentially China might be going on some form of war footing of sorts.
We do hear this from time to time. I mean, basically, there's part of it is domestic politics. It is good for China's political morale, I guess you could say, to be on this kind of war footing. He'll make these speeches. He'll urge the PLA, that's the People's Liberation Army, to be ready at any moment. But we hear this kind of every 6 months in a cycle. That's not to say that China isn't preparing for some sort of conflict in the future. It would be very surprising if a superpower of its size wasn't. But to suggest that each time they roll out this let's be on a war footing claim means that we're preparing for an imminent invasion, I think it might be stretching it a bit. But nonetheless, what does General Li's demotion or perhaps his dumping mean? Well, it really means that the person that the Australian military, the British military and the American military deal with is going to be someone different. He was basically the public face. So he's not really responsible for military strategy. He is responsible for public relations. And so those day-to-day negotiations, someone, whenever they decide to announce it, it's now been a few weeks, will have to come in and take control of those.
That's right. So as you say, a slightly different system to the one we're used to. You talk about Wang Yi. He's on his way to Russia to talk about strategic matters there. What is that about? Is it more just signalling that they are, continuing to forge this relationship with Russia almost as an alternative alliance?
The timing's fascinating because we've just had Kim Jong-un arrive in Russia for meetings with Vladimir Putin. Now you have Wang Yi heading there himself. I don't know how thrilled China would have been that Kim Jong-un's first trip overseas was to Russia. China very much sees North Korea as kind of one of its vassal states, and believes that, patronage should come from the North. So to see Kim Jong-un traveling there is a very interesting development. Wang Yi, again, you've got this situation that China is continuing to try and play peacemaker, trying to negotiate something out of Ukraine whilst eking out as much power out of this geopolitical competition as it can. And that's what those visits and that continued contact with Russia is about. It's very much setting up it as the dominant player in the region, and making sure it's got a strong hand in those negotiations.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Eric, we've got the UN meeting in New York, and really Biden is the only significant leader present. Does it signal to you that China is really not interested in playing that kind of sort of game any longer, that there's a cohesive United Nations?
Well, Xi Jinping seems to have checked out of major international forums. I mean, the G20, it's about as big as it gets. Of course, he didn't want to really give Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the credit. He's kind of great rival in Asia, potentially the next big superpower competition, and decided not to turn up. He now is, I think, focused on solidifying his domestic power. The Chinese economy is really struggling. He's got these political battles internally. All of that points to a situation where he sees the domestic front rather than the international front as his most significant policy priority. At the same time, he's in his third term. He's kind of in unprecedented territory here. And really, at that point, in a kind of almost, chairman, emperor-like position, you can send your minions out to do your bidding for you at international forums. And so I do wonder whether we will see the Premier Li Qiang more and more active on those fronts in future. Wang Yi, likewise, while Xi really controls the tempo at home. And it kind of projects an image of power, because what you end up happening is leaders like Anthony Albanese, who will go there later this year, come to you. And you get to put on the pageantry, the red carpet, the gun salutes, all of the symbolism of Beijing without having to leave your fortress. And so that's incredibly powerful symbolism, I think, Xi Jinping, and I suspect that's what we will continue to see.
Yeah, fascinating. Always great to get your thoughts. Eric, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Dave.